Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other countries stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. Alright, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In two words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Ah, supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, a fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion, after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war, but one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and Senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a two-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. New Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us two houses: a House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though, of course, they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons — the word slave was never used — would be the basis for the calculation. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced 2 principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary, and the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state government. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process, and then on the battlefield.